Good morning. Hello, once again. This is a continuation of our discussion, our reading on Pastor Thomas Odimba's The Great Secrets of Israel. My name is Dion. This presentation is brought to you by Operation Isaiah 58 Biblical Literacy Institute, where we're reading critically as a righteous act. And some might add, why do you say you're reading as a righteous act? Because as students of the Hebrew Bible, we are admonished to study. The scripture says to study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And when we look at that word study in the dictionary, it means to spend a devotion of time doing a detailed investigation and analysis of a subject or situation, especially by means of books. And so when we are admonished to study, it is basically, in a nutshell, a detailed investigation and analysis. And we know that reading critically and analytically is a scientific endeavor. So some might say, well, so is the Bible a science book? Is the Bible promoting the scientific method? Well, yes, indeed, your analysis conclusion is correct. The Bible is promoting the scientific method. Now, among other scriptures, there is another scripture that I want to put out there where it admonishes the students of the Bible to prove all things. And as we all know, that proving means providing evidence, and providing evidence also entails scientific procedures and practices. With that said, I'm going to get right into the discussion and conversation. I hope you are enjoying your day and your studies and your research. We're going to continue reading chapter 5. In this presentation, we'll be reading from the we will be reading this portion of chapter 5. So the return of the kingdom of Israel to Africa in about 721 BC, the return of Judah to Africa, the third and last return, the historical reason for the return of the Jews to Africa, and the presence of Jews in Africa according to the scriptures. Also in chapter 5, will be covered the origin of the two Jewish races, racial influence, Egyptian influence on the Jewish race, archaeological data, and the portrait of the Jews during the time of Jesus, influence of the Phoenician and Western races. Also, Pastor Odimba covers the membership of the family of Israel in chapter 5, the archers or the armies of Black Africa, origins of each group of archers, the Pools or the Pulans, the Tutsi, a Hutu or the Hum. And we are going to find out some fascinating information and history and scholarship about the Rwanda genocide. I'm going to go into, he goes into some details about these people and the perpetrators of this genocide. And the story that we were told by mainstream media is vastly different than the one presented in this research and scholarship by Pastor Odimba. He's going to go into another fascinating conversation about the origins of the word Africa. And you want to stay tuned for this particular conversation, because you will be surprised at what the discovery he has discovered and uncovered about this word Africa. In chapter 5, he goes into Judah and the Philistines in the West, and the presence of Judaism in Black Africa, the priest, the faith, and the temple. And finally, the migration of the people and priests of Judaism. Migration of the people, migration of the Jewish priest to South Africa, the history of this migration, genetic relationship between the priests of Zimbabwe and the Kohens of Europe, dispersal of priests and pilgrims from Zimbabwe, the toponymy of the Baganda region, the end of Judaism in Africa, the disappearance of the priests from Rwanda, and the biblical reason for the end of Judaism in Black Africa. And the final section of chapter 5 will include the the presence of the kingdom of Israel. So we talk about the kingdom of Israel, we're talking about the 10 tribes in Black Africa, demography, the cultural and linguistic unity of the Bantus, the domination of the Jews in Congo, and toponymy and anthroponymy in Congo. And after that, that's when Pastor Odimba begins the section 2, the translation of the Song of Songs, according to the African palaver, which is a literary genre of the Semitic Black race of Africa. Okay, so let's read. Page 35, section 1, History of Israel Before and After Solomon by Pastor Thomas Odimba, chapter 5, The Presence of Jews in Africa After Solomon. Now, page 35, as I stated before, I will not be posting the entire book on these slides. Only information that I wish to highlight will be posted on the slide. So I will be going back and forth as I read from the book to the slides. So this part explains the link that exists between the people from whom we got the translation of the Song of Songs and the Jews of the time of Solomon. Now, for some of you who followed the conversation, you remember that the people he mentioned, I think it was in the introduction or the introduction or the preface, where he stated that he had to go to the elders of the Congo to get this translation of the Song of Songs. So the people or the elders of the Congo, he's going to explain this. There's the link between these people and the Jews of the time of Solomon. It is worthy of note that until the reign of Solomon, the people remained united and formed the nation called Israel, made up of 12 tribes, and lived in Canaan in Palestine. So it is worthy of note that until the reign of Solomon, the people remained united and formed the nation called Israel, made up of the 12 tribes, and lived in Canaan in Palestine. Okay, so I don't know how that slide got in here. Okay, continue. It reads, Israel was divided into 2 groups under the reign of Rehoboam, son of Solomon, who he had with Naamah, an Ammonite. This was the last king in Israel before the division of the kingdom, and the first king of Judah as a separate kingdom. From this era, there were 2 kingdoms, that of Israel, composed of 10 tribes, namely Reuben, Simon, Manasseh, Ephraim, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, and Zebulun, and that of Judah, which was composed of 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. After the separation and devastation, the majority of the people that formed the 2 kingdoms went back to Africa, where they came from. A minority dispersed in the West, East, and in Asia, trying to escape the persecution. According to the Talmud, which was written by the great Rabbi Mar Zutra, the 10 tribes that constituted the kingdom of Israel went to Africa. Now, we want to really pay attention to this information because we're talking about identity empowerment and the peoplehood. We as Mr. Asa G. Hillard in the afterword of the wonderful Ethiopians of the ancient Kushite Empire by Miss Drusilla Dungy Houston, he stated that Black folk are intrigued by the individual accomplishments of Blacks during the time of in talking about Black history. But he asked the question, where is the peoplehood? Or where is the story, the narrative, the history of Black folk? And I want to read really quickly, it just came to my mind about the peoplehood definition. I looked this definition up, and when you look up peoplehood, it means this: the fact or state of being a community of people of shared race or nationality, often with the implication of associated status or rights. Okay? It's also the awareness of one's identity as a member of a particular people. All right. So we're going into this awareness of our identity. And our identity as members, not just, solo, I'm riding solo, like all of a sudden we don't have any more Black groups. Like back in the day, it was always the group. We had New Edition, the Jackson 5, and the Temptations, and I mean, it was groups. And then all of a sudden, the individuals wanted to break off from the group and be highlighted, solo artists. So no, this is not identity, is not about your, as the Greco-Roman, in the Greco-Roman ideology, it's about individualism and being independent of the group, anti-community. But the elders are saying we need to be focusing on peoplehood, which is an expression, an awareness of our identity as members of a particular people. And so here we are finding out that according to the Talmud, which was written by the great Rabbi Mar Zutra, the 10 tribes that constituted the Kingdom of Israel went to Africa. The important group was the one that went to Africa and to the West, according to biblical prophecy. We shall therefore direct our attention to the group that is in Africa. So again, he wants to establish the link between the translation that exists between the people from whom we got this translation, the Congo elders, the elders of the Congo, and the Jews of the time of Solomon. Now, it goes on to read, the return of the Israelites. The return of the Israelites to Africa. The title could appear funny to those who have not very well studied the scriptures. However, the sacred writings clearly describe all that there is about the exodus of the Jew towards Africa and when that took place, be it before Solomon or after him, and why. And he brings out a very important observation when he states about the return of the Israelites to Africa. The title could appear funny to those who have not very well studied the scriptures, but it's clear in the Bible. If you haven't studied very well, which brings to mind my conversation I had with Sister First Lady, who is she's a very influential woman here locally and, nationwide. I would say her husband is a bishop of the most prominent Pentecostal organizations in the world. And she said, well, I was bringing some of this information out to her, and she said, well, nobody knew. We didn't know. And my friend said, well, why didn't they know? It's in the Bible. But again, it goes back, what were you doing in Bible study? What is it going on in these churches? These churches where you've been reading the Bible all your life. Some was making the connections and connecting the dots, but the majority that are still there makes you wonder. But yes, he says that this information might appear funny to those who have not very well studied the scriptures, but the sacred writings clearly describe all that there is about the exodus of the Jews towards Africa and when that took place, be it before Solomon or after him, and why. And this is also goes out to, those that are studying Torah in the synagogues, the rabbis. I was talking with one rabbi yesterday, and, sharing with him some of this information and the look of it on his face. I mean, I wish I could have taken a photograph when they see. He was the second rabbi that I've reached out to, and these are highly studied and learned men. And how is it that you missed what Pastor Odimba is bringing to our attention? It is clear in the text that they went to Africa. And so he says the Jews in Africa, and when that took place, be it before Solomon or after him, and why. The prophetic vision of Joseph about the return of the descendants of his brothers to Africa is therefore not an isolated case. Jacob remembers the presence of these Jews of Joseph and even indicates their position behind a wall. The vegetation and the persecution that will follow later on the African soil. This can be found in Genesis chapter 49, verse 22 through 25. It reads, quote, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. This prophecy made it possible for us to locate these Jewish colonies in Africa. This is because under the domination of the Ottoman Empire, a human wall was erected from the north of Senegal up to Somali. And that enables us to acknowledge the presence of very tall Black men, the Hamites, of whom we shall talk about later on, between the Arabs and the Semitic Bantus. So he mentioned the Ottoman Empire. And just to catch some of us up to speed, we are reading critically and analytically. We're going to go into some history, and we see that the Ottoman Empire was one of the mightiest and longest lasting dynasties in world history. And I didn't know that. Did you? This Islamic-run superpower ruled large areas of the Middle East Eastern Europe, and North Africa for more than 600 years. By 1517, Bayezid's son, Selim I, brought Syria, Arabia, Palestine, it's the key territory that we are studying, and Egypt under Ottoman control. So Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring, his branches run over the wall. Mr. Odimba states that this is because this prophecy makes it possible for us to locate these Jewish colonies in Africa. This is because under the domination of the Ottoman Empire, a human wall was erected from the north of Senegal up to Somali. That enables us to acknowledge the presence of very tall Black men, the Hamites, of whom we shall talk about later on, between the Arabs and the Semitic Bantus. So here we have a map of the Ottoman Empire towards the end of the 17th century. All of this. And Senegal, he mentioned Senegal, which is over here in the west of Africa. So the human wall erected of the north of Senegal. So the north part of Senegal. And he says all the way up to Somali. Here is Somali. So here we have Somalia. Okay. And here's some information. Turkey enjoys a history of relations with Somalia dating back to the 16th century in the era of the Ottoman Empire. And these are Somalians, a Black race of people in Africa, as we know now, that are of the Hamitic lineage. Hamitic Blacks. It goes on to read, in chapter 37 of the book of Ezekiel, the prophet talked about In chapter 37 of the book of Ezekiel, the prophet talked about the meeting between the Jews of Joseph and those of Judah who were going to come back to the land after a long period of persecution. Besides, the return to Egypt in boats was announced as a consequence of the sin. This is expressed in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 58 and 68. It reads, quote, if you do not diligently observe all the words of this law that are written in this book, fearing this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God. Verse 68, the Lord will bring you back in ships to Egypt by a route that I promised you would never see again. And there you shall offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but there will be no buyer. We shall realize the apostasy that existed in Israel as an independent state before its dispersal, and the apostasy of Judah before and during the Roman domination. This is very well illustrated in Jeremiah chapter 44, verses 16 through 20. It reads, as for the word that you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we are not going to listen to you. Verse 17, instead, we will do everything that we have vowed, make our offerings to the Queen of Heaven, and pour out libations to her, just as we and our ancestors, our kings and our officials used to do in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. We used to have plenty of food and prospered and saw no misfortune. Verse 18, but from the time we stopped making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out our libations to her, we have lacked everything and have perished by the sword and famine. Verse 19, and the women said, indeed, we will go on making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations to her. Do you think that we have made cakes for her, marked with her image, and poured out libations to her without our husbands being involved? So Pastor Odimba is identifying the state of apostasy that existed in Israel as an independent state before their dispersal, and the apostasy of Judah before and during the Roman domination. Now, this word apostasy, I wanted to look up in the dictionary, and in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it's simply an act of refusing to continue to follow, obey, or recognize, and here they say a religious faith. But as all of us are well aware, students of the Bible, that the Bible is not a religion and it's not a religious book. It's a culture. The Bible is the national literature of the ancient Israelite people. Just like, I often like to use the example, just like the English Anthology of English Literature, the Norton Anthology of English Literature, as it's called, titled, it's the national literature of the Anglo-Saxon people. It's not a religious book. So is the Hebrew Bible, the national literature of the ancient Israelite people. It's not a religious book, and it's not describing a religion. However, you know, as the Greco-Romans, the new overlords, they call it a religion. So the act of refusing to or continue to follow or obey or recognize a religious faith, or the abandonment of a previous loyalty, defection, I think, is a better word or definition of apostasy. It's similar to an act of treason, because we're talking about laws and legislation, and we're talking about politics. So not religion. So the apostate Israel, you know, they had defected. Judah, the tribes of Judah, Benjamin and Judah, and also the 10 tribes, the kingdom of Israel. It was an act of treason, and treason is often associated with an act against the monarch or king. And in this case, they defected, or they committed treason against their king, Yahweh, and their covenant and contract, a blood sacrifice that they had, their ancestors had made with the Eternal One. Now, when we talk about the Queen of Heaven and this apostasy that took place, some may, you know, look at, you know, the worshiping of idols and this language that's used, the Queen of Heaven, and, you know, the physical act of bowing down to idols as what was prohibited in the legislation of Moses. However, when we look a little closer and examine, and we put on the critical analytical lens, we can kind of get more of an in-depth understanding, I think, to this practice or this worship of the heathen or the pagans, and in the laws of the Eternal One. the children of Israel are commanded to learn not the way of the heathen or the nations or the pagans. And this is also seen in this worship of this practice of the Christmas celebration. If you go and do your research, you'll find the origins. This is an ancient Babylonian tradition. There's a lot that it goes into, but in Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 1-5, he states, "Hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the custom of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with an axe. They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it moves not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither also is it in them to do good." So here he's commanding the children, the house of Israel, to learn not the way of the heathen. And this is also, the queen of the heaven, this practice, this apostasy of the children of Israel when they go into all of these different heathenistic practices and celebrations. Now, when we look more closely at the heathens and their celebrations, and we follow the trail, and they say that you can follow it, and it always ends up, you'll find that there's a lot of money involved. It's more than just, going out and, singing Christmas carols and, putting a tree in your home and decking it to look beautiful and shiny and glittery. And, it does create a sense of merriment in the home or whatnot. But if you look critically and analytically, U.S. Christmas season statistics and facts, this was published by one D. Tije on the 2021, December 14th. And he says that in the United States, Christmas is celebrated on December 24th. It is a civil holiday that is enjoyed by an increasing number of non-Christians and is an integral part of the holiday season, and Christians also. In 2021, 85% of the people in the United States stated they were planning to celebrate the holiday, with only 1 in 10 declaring that they would not be joining in with the festivities. Christmas is typically the largest, now get this, economic stimulus for many nations. The largest economic stimulus for many nations around the world, as sales increase dramatically in almost all retail areas. In 2021, total holiday retail sales were projected to have reached new highs of almost $850 billion US. Now just let that sink in. And as King Solomon stated, there's nothing new under the sun. So you can imagine all of these celebrations of the heathens and the pagans, the festivities, it comes to and all amounts to the money, the almighty dollar, and the strengthening of their empire, the strengthening of and the continuation of their evil and wicked practices. So now we can kind of understand the social and political and economic impact of celebrating these heathenistic festivities and celebrations, which the children of Israel are commanded not to learn or to participate in. So when they defected from their legislation and their laws, they contributed to the strength of the pagan and the wicked empires that were round about them. So let's return to the reading in chapter 5. Now, he says that on page 37, failure to go according to the principles of a covenant concluded upon vows with God could result in serious consequences, which are emphasized in the clauses of the alliance inter alia, the return to Africa in order to receive correction. Now, the return of the kingdom of Israel in Africa to about 721 BC on page 37. This is the subtitle, the return of the kingdom of Israel to Africa in about 721 BC. It was the first group that left Palestine to return to Africa, Egypt in parentheses. In the year 721 BC, the Bible indicated a massive departure in Egypt from the kingdom of Israel, which was made up of the 10 tribes, all grouped under the name of Ephraim. At the time, this kingdom fell. It is worthy of note that the rest of the kingdom of Israel fell into the hands of the Assyrians under King Sargon II, 721 to 715 BC, who deported more than 27,290 Jews. Assyrian Annals and Bible Dictionary. This brought an end to the kingdom of Israel as an independent nation. At the time of this attack, Hosea asked for the support of his brother, the Pharaoh Shaba of So, the king of Egypt, 2 Kings 17, verses 4 through 8, and Hosea chapter 7, verse 11, whose help came late at the time the people had already fled to Egypt before the intervention. This departure was announced before the devastation in the book of Hosea, chapter 9, verse 3. Quote, "They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and in Assyria they shall eat unclean food." Now, some of you may not know what the unclean food is referring to. Well, it's in the laws, the culture, part of the culture of the children of Israel. There is a dietary law, which forbids the eating of certain animals, shellfish, namely shellfish and pork. And, please refer to that section of the legislation of the laws. You can find a list of the unclean food. And here it states that they're going to go into Israel and Assyria and they shall eat unclean food. For even if they escape destruction, Egypt shall gather them, Memphis shall bury them, nettles shall possess their precious things of silver, thorns shall be their tents. And so this is obviously figurative language. So it basically means that in the places where their tents were formerly pitched will be thorns. And he says, in the course of their journey to Africa, the people of the kingdom of Judah saw them pass by into their land, and the prophet Hosea remembered what their brothers of the kingdom said. Hosea chapter 9, verse 6. For even if they escape destruction, here it is, Egypt shall gather them, Memphis shall bury them, nettles shall possess their precious things of silver, thorns shall be their tents. Let us also note that, Pastor Odimba goes on to state, let us note that So was the name of the territory of the Nubian pharaoh called Shaba, who conquered Egypt under the 25th dynasty. He was the one who received the Israelites who went to Africa during this era. Research has revealed that the kingdom of Shaba, just like those of other pharaohs who came after him, Musiris, Lod, Kub, Puth, Amasis, Ophrah, and who were unconditionally attached to Israel, ended up in the Congo, Zaire, after their escape from Egypt. The question then arises as to whether all these pharaohs were not Jews, given that they always defended the cause of Israel to the peril of their own lives. So King of Egypt. So Shabaka reigned from 721, about 712 to 696, around about 696 BC, was a Nubian king who established the 25th dynasty in Lower Egypt and thus became the first of the quote unquote Ethiopian pharaohs. He was succeeded his brother Pianki as ruler of the Nubian kingdom of Kush in what is now southern Sudan. Shabaka is often identified with the So of the Old Testament who fought the Assyrians, but this identification is highly tenuous, and we know why. Found this in the encyclopedia.com history. And here's the scripture where So is mentioned, 2 Kings 17, verse 4, and the king of Syria found conspiracy in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. While escaping the Chaldeans, now this is the first return of Judea. This is the subtitle, the first return of Judea to Africa. It reads, while escaping the Chaldeans between 597 and 586 BC, the kingdom of Judah joined the kingdom of Israel, which was already in Africa. The pharaoh, Ophrah, tried unsuccessfully to free Jerusalem from the occupation of King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, Jeremiah 37 and 8. The scenario is depicted in 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 26, quote, then all the people high and low and the captains of the forces sent out and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans, end quote. Okay. One moment, please. Okay, so the return of the kingdom of Israel to Africa in about 597 BC, the second group. So we were covering the return of kingdom of Israel to Africa in about 721. One moment. Okay. And now the next section is the return of the kingdom of Israel to Africa in about 597 BC, the second group. Now, The two tribes that were made up of the descendants of Judah and Benjamin, which were all grouped under the kingdom of Judah, were not attacked by the Assyrians in 721. They were rather deported 3 times from the Assyrian states, Chaldeans, Babylonians, and Romans. With 3 of the deportations coming from the north and the east, the southern direction became the only escape route to Egypt and Africa. In the year 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, deported the elites in the kingdom of Judah, Daniel chapter 1, verse 14. 2 other deportations took place at the time of the fall of Jerusalem under the murder of its governor, Gedaliah. Now, we want to look into this assassination, the return of the kingdom of Israel to Africa in about 597 BC. The second group, the assassination of Gedaliah, governor of Judea, is quoted in Jeremiah 4:1, verses 2 through 3. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, and the 10 men who were with him murdered Gedaliah, together with most of the Jews who had joined him and many Babylonians whom Nebuchadnezzar had left with Gedaliah. The remaining Judeans feared the vengeance of Nebuchadnezzar and fled to Egypt. So this was found in Wikipedia, the Free Encyclopedia. He was, according to the narratives in the Hebrew Bible's book of Jeremiah and second book of Kings, appointed by Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon as governor of Yehud province, which was formed after the defeat of the kingdom of Judah and the destruction of Jerusalem in a part of the territory that previously formed the kingdom. He was supported by a Chaldean guard stationed at Mitzvah, and on hearing of the appointment, the Jews that had taken refuge in surrounding countries returned to Judah. Gedaliah was the son of Ahikam, who saved the life of the prophet Jeremiah, and the grandson of Shaphan, who is mentioned in relation to the discovery of the scroll of teaching that some scholars identify as the core book of Deuteronomy. He zealously began to encourage the people to cultivate the fields and vineyards, and thus laid the foundation of security. Many who had fled to neighboring lands during the war of destruction were attracted by the news of the revival of the community. They came to Gedaliah in Mitzvah and were warmly welcomed by him. And here again, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, and the 10 men who were with him murdered Gedaliah together with most of the Jews who had joined him and many Babylonians whom Nebuchadnezzar had left with Gedaliah. Jeremiah 4, verses 41, verses 2 through 3. The remaining Judeans feared the vengeance of Nebuchadnezzar and fled to Egypt. Although the dates are not clear from the Bible, this probably happened about 582 BCE, some 4 to 5 years and 3 months after the destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple in 586 BCE. Then so this is under the first return of Judah now to Africa. So the first return of Judah to Africa. While escaping the Chaldeans, it states between 597 and 586 BC, the kingdom of Judah joined the kingdom of Israel, which was already in Africa. The Pharaoh Ophrah tried unsuccessfully to free Jerusalem from the occupation of King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, Jeremiah 37:8. The scenario is depicted in 2 Kings 25, verse 26. Then all the people high and low and the captains of the forces set out and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. The elite class that was brought to Babylon during the first deportation came back to Jerusalem and started the reconstruction of the town and the temple that were destroyed when they were attacked again by the Babylonians. They escaped to Africa as testified in Jeremiah 43, verses 5 through 6. But, quote, but Johanan, son of Kareah, And all the commanders of the forces took all the remnant of Judah who had returned to settle in the land of Judah from all the nations to which they had been driven. Verse 6, the men, the women, the children, the princes, and everyone whom Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had left with Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, son of Shaphan, also the prophet Jeremiah, and Baruch, son of Neriah. The third and last return. This is the subtitle, The Third and Last Return, page 38. In the year 465 BC, the Jewish diaspora returned from Persia, currently Iran, to Jerusalem with Nehemiah, 465 to 424 BC, and Esdras, 444 BC. Nehemiah caused the wall of Jerusalem to be constructed within 52 days and put himself at the disposal of the alliance with Egypt, which made it possible for all Jews from the two territories to go up to Jerusalem to worship God. Before the beginning of the Christian era, the Romans occupied Jerusalem, and Herod initiated some significant modifications to the Second Temple in 19 BC and finally completed them in the year 64 AD. So it continues on, the third and last return. The revolt of the Jews against Rome in 66 AD forced the Romans to destroy the Second Temple in 70 AD. This marked the fall of Jerusalem and Palestine. The Jews who were in Africa during the time of the devastation went to Jerusalem to rescue their brothers and to direct them through the desert route because the Isthmus of Suez was closed at that time. This is the reason why all Jews who were dark in complexion were mistaken for Egyptians, Acts of the Apostles. They therefore crossed the Red Sea in canoes as Moses had directed in order to get to Egypt, as indicated in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68. The Lord will bring you back in ships to Egypt by a route that I promised you would never see again, and there you shall offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but there will be no buyer. The people of Judea went to Africa for the third and the last time to escape from the Romans. This is confirmed in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. Thus, quote, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. The troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with the flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Period, end quote. Continuing on in section 1, Pastor Thomas Odimba in chapter 5, the presence of Jews in Africa after Solomon, on page 39, the third and last return. It reads, the destruction of the Second Temple separated the two brotherly people. Those who were in Rome remained in the West, and those who had left to Africa continued towards the southern part of the continent in the effort to escape the attacks of the Romans and the Arabs. So when we talk about our people who are Muslims, it makes me wonder about how much research and studying they have done, because when you research and study, you'll come to understand that these Muslims, these Arabs, along with the Romans, they are the enemies, and they're Hamitic the scientific research and scholarship is revealing the Hamitic origins of the Arabs, the Muslims. And if you read, which I plan to read on this platform, the next book that we are going to be reading is The Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire by Drusilla Dunjee Houston. So those of you who want to participate in that reading, I'm giving you a heads up. But in this book, she also identifies two Arabic races, the Semitic Arabs and the Hamitic Arab race. It's very interesting information. So it goes on to read that the brotherly link between the Jews of the West in Rome and those in Africa was cut after this devastation and was announced in Zechariah 11, chapter 11, verse 14, quote, "Then I broke my second staff unity, annulling the family ties between Judah and Israel." And this is very sad part to me when I read this. Is very sad because this explains in part the disunity that is among the people in the Bantus of Africa and those that are living in America and scattered in other parts of the world. That this last return, the destruction of the Second Temple, is when the two brotherly people were finally separated. This unity that was broken and the annulling of the family ties between Judah and Israel. Now, I'm still on page 39. The massive return of these Jews took place in consonance with the first vision of Joseph. We shall consequently discuss these Jews of Joseph up to contemporary times in light of the prophetic predictions. The conformity between prophecy and the history of the African Jews make it possible for us to understand that it was all the manifestation of God himself. Now, the historical reason for the return of the Jews to Africa, that's the subtitle on page 40. It is obvious that the Jews lived in the Middle East, that Abraham, the father of the Jews, was a native of Chaldea, although he was not an Israelite, since he was not the son, but the father of Israel. Israel, and for that matter, Jacob, with his small family amidst many other ethnic groups in the Middle East. This small family migrated to Egypt, where they enjoyed special favors from Pharaoh and Joseph. The 4 centuries that they spent in Egypt before the persecution and the number of years that Abraham was away from his native Chaldea virtually blurred their links with the Chaldeans. The proof was that they were deported to Chaldea. This shows that the Chaldeans no more recognized them as kinsmen. All the other lands where they had been, they went for the purpose of business transactions or were deported. However, the sojourn in Egypt was for survival or a peaceful stay. The Egyptians welcomed them as neighbors. This is explained by their long stay and intermarriage. Some of them are still living in Egypt. They do not know any other country so well as Egypt and ancient Ethiopia. It is because they were Egyptians that they returned to this country. Otherwise, they would have gone elsewhere. Now, the next subsection of this chapter, the presence of the Jews in Africa, according to the scriptures on page 40, it reads, "The presence of the Jews in Africa was written in several prophetic and historical texts that manifest itself on the continent in various ways, namely place names, anthroponymy, genetics, as well as in the presence of the Jewish faith and tradition. All the issues related to the presence of the Jews is confirmed in history through prophecies such as Jeremiah 44:1. The word that came to Jeremiah for all the Judeans living in the land of Egypt, at Migdal, at Taphanes, at Tapanes, at Memphis, and in the land of Pathros. In verse 24, quote, Jeremiah said to all the people and all the women, hear ye the word of the Lord, all you Judeans who are in the land of Egypt, end quote. These passages attest to the presence of this people in Africa. Jeremiah 44:27 demonstrates their refusal to return to Israel, despite the insistence of the prophet Jeremiah. It reads, quote, I am going to watch over them for harm and not for good. All the people of Judah who are in the land of Egypt shall perish by the sword and by famine until none is left. The threat of exterminating these Jews was indicated in Jeremiah 44, verse 28 through 30. Pastor Odimba draws our attention to this verse, these verses. Quote, and those who escape the sword shall return from the land of Egypt to the land of Judah, few in number, and all the remnant of Judah who have come to the land of Egypt to settle shall know whose words will stand, mine or theirs. Verse 29, this shall be the sign to you, says the Lord, that I am going to punish you in this place in order that you may know that my words against you will surely be carried out. Verse 30, thus says the Lord, I am going to give Pharaoh, Hophra, king of Egypt, into the hands of his enemies, those who seek his life, just as I gave King Zedekiah of Judah into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, his enemy who sought his life. End quote. And so the persistent question, it reads on page 41, the persistent question then is that of race. How did it come about that these Jews are dark-skinned while others are light-skinned? And so that's going to conclude this section of chapter 5. In our next conversation, we will go into the next section of the presence of Jews in Africa after Solomon, and where Pastor Odimba will go into the origin of the two Jewish races, racial influence, Egyptian influence on the Jewish race, archaeological data on the portrait of the Jews during the time of Jesus, and the influence of the Phoenician and Western races. I'm going to leave you with this thought I found online. It's a very poignant quote. Mental slavery is the worst form of slavery. It gives you the illusion of freedom. It makes you trust, love, and defend your oppressor while making you an enemy of those who are trying to free you or open your eyes. Peace and blessings to all who love the truth. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope that you will continue in your research and studies. Happy studies. Love you.